She wants to start precise.
Yeah.
So I need notes or anything. That's a pros.
Oh, so you haven't heard us talk yet.
I haven't done anything. You've rehearsed it. Experience counts, right? I miss. I hope you're paying good attention to what Phil said. Section 4 was a big part of what Phil did, right?
All right, we're ready. We're ready to go. Please find your seats if you're getting coffee or you got coffee, and we'll get started. For the next presentation, I'm glad to welcome a multi-regional approach. We're going to talk about ER enterprise themes and best practices for sustaining accurate facility ratings. This is an area that began rather as an ER enterprise call to action a couple of years ago. As we discussed briefly at the beginning of at the end of the last presentation, we started to see that this was an area that there continued to be some fall downs. And even though many of the individual fall downs may not in and of themselves been serious, facility ratings are a foundational element that's used across planning and operations and have a lot of connections to a lot of things. So the ER enterprise has been working for a while to document a lot of themes and best practices and to develop strategies to ensure that we're monitoring these in a very risk-informed and coordinated way across the ER enterprise. And with that, I'm happy to welcome my colleagues that come from 2 of the different regions, but rest assured that all 6 of the regions and NERC are aligned in this approach, and they're going to highlight themes and best practices that are connected to a report that was just issued publicly last week as well, that you may have seen from NERC. So it's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Norman from MRO out of St. Paul, Curtis Cruz from Texas RE out of Austin, Texas, and then Michael Dalebout, of course, from WEC. Welcome, gentlemen, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you. If you can hear my voice, please stand up. All right. If you can hear my voice, please stand up. Please stand up. If you can hear my voice, please stand up and clap your hands. Standing ovation. Wonderful. That's great. All right. Thanks. You can have a seat. We got a standing ovation before we even started. Yeah, I know everybody is anxious for us to get through this presentation as lunch is coming, but you'll just have to hold your horses. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. So, facility ratings. Talk about just-in-time presentations. 5 days ago, this report went live, and I'm sure you've all read it, right? These are the best practices for sustaining accurate facility ratings. I want to point out the focus is on accuracy, not appropriateness. So although the prior presentation did get into some considerations for appropriateness, this is really focused purely on accuracy. Why are facility ratings important? Facility ratings is fundamental to our understanding of the capabilities of the system. As we are more integrated and interconnected with the ability to interact and influence our neighboring systems with the actions that we take, as we get better at driving the system, as we get more renewables on the system, it becomes more and more critical that the planning, the operators, the protection system, engineers, technical staff have a common understanding of the capabilities of the system. It is a fundamental way we communicate. Because it's fundamental, it's important we get it right. What's 5 plus 5? I say it's 12. I was using base 8. You had no way of knowing that, right? So both answers are correct. I was using a different methodology. So this affects the RC, the TOP, the generation owners, SOLs are built out of them. And along with the nature of the evolving grid, we also have a recent 881 order. Now that's not in the standard, right? But I consistently want to emphasize one set of books, right? Makes everything easier. So what used to be complex has been multiplied by a factor of 10 or more. But what this comes down to is it's all about the equipment and understanding what's in the field. So we're going to walk through this report at a high level, covering the background, the themes, sustainability of your facility rating program, and really the conclusions and appendix as well. But this is really an observation from all 6 regions. So this document did initially start in CERC and was a very good document. It was taken up by the Euro Enterprise and evolved and improved since then to really show what we're seeing in the field. This is across all of North America. These are the best practices we see, and or lack thereof is why people might be tripping up. Number one is lack of awareness. Facility ratings are fundamental, but that might be taken for granted by some staff within the organization as to how it's leveraged across multiple departments. It's very important from senior leadership on down that awareness of accurate facility ratings is emphasized within an organization and how they communicate with their neighboring organizations to ensure that this is covered. You need to define the environment that you're working in, the internal controls needed to maintain reliable systems. Fundamental control is your facility ratings, is your source of truth. That is fundamental. If your models are built off of your facility rating documentation, whether it's for real-time operations or your planning models, the accuracy of that facility rating model of that facility ratings documentation is going to be inherently better. In addition, who owns the various aspects of facility ratings? Is it a shared ownership across multiple departments with a level of coordination between them? Is it housed within planning? Is it housed within operation? But understanding who's responsible for it, and when an issue comes up, when an error is found, how to get that information to those individuals responsible for the program. And within that, define the process, define the roles, define the responsibilities. In addition, training for all departments and contractors in this involved. What's your change management process? You're going to upgrade a line next year. You have designed that line to increase the rating by 10%. You know that today. You can prepare your documentation for the as design so that when it goes into service, you've already got the fundamental knowledge of what that is. In addition, what's in the field? What do we not know about? There are facilities out there that are older than many of us in the room that are operating today, where the documentation might not be readily available. How is your program going to address that? Test the program, validate, and verify. If you're able to systematically go through your facility rating methodology over time and ensure that each and every piece of equipment is accurately rated, it's not very hard to do the math from there, right? you get the equipment rating right, you know that that is what's in the field, you're in a very strong position. So that accurate baseline is fundamental, but then the field verification as things change, and what are the triggers for those changes? Well, system restoration is one, right? Lineman needs to get a facility back up and running, may not have had the correct jumper in place, puts in a different jumper. Maybe it's rated more, maybe it's rated slightly less. That information needs to get back into the system so that you know what's in the field. And really identify all the equipment that's out there, make sure you don't miss a piece. Take photos, grab nameplates, grab source documentation, and really have a comprehensive assessment of all that serial pieces of equipment that make up the facility. And of course, establish a corrective action plan. That's fundamental to risk management and continuous improvement. Errors are going to occur. Changes are going to happen. How is your process going to be proactive and set up to take those inputs in, to find them quickly and address them and move on? Curtis? Double fist mics.
I wish you were done with that, Mike. No, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I really appreciate WEC putting this together and inviting us here as a ERO enterprise. It's fantastic to see that from Texas RE. I would have never, 5 years ago, I would have never thought I would have been in front of a WEC crowd. And I really appreciate meeting some of you and talking to you about different things, but we're here today to talk about that report. And that report was given 5 days ago. So this whole presentation was given behind the scenes as well. So the presentation that we put together and we studied and we looked at changed. We call that resiliency. We're adapting to that change, right? But it's always a pleasure to be up here on the stage with Jeff. First time I've been up here with Michael. It's good to see Jeff before he hibernates for the winter. You know, in Texas, we don't get snow at all. But be careful with that one. We got a law against it now, I think. But we're going to talk about best practices here. And I want you to think about something. What's the obverse? What is the opposite side of the coin from best practices? It's incomplete successful practices, ones that don't quite make it. So when you see these best practices from across the ERO enterprise, that's the things that we have seen that have worked best. We've also seen that other side more often than we all care to admit. So one of the best things that we've seen was a single official master database. What's that mean? Why is it a best practice? Well, you've got to have it all in one location so everybody knows what that rating should be, what feeds into that rating, what equipment feeds into that. Because we have seen over time that Department X has a database, Department Y has a database, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. They don't necessarily have that communication. They don't have that understanding. I know there was a discussion about planning earlier, you know, in the ERCOT world, and that's where I come from, the operations model feeds into the planning model. So all the facility ratings feed in from the operating model into that planning model. It's very interesting because that is a single official master database from the ERCOT perspective, not from the TO perspective or the GO perspective. And how many of you have less than 5 facilities to rate? Raise your hand. I'm not going to get you up and clap. How many have 100? How many have more than that? Think about how many pieces of equipment go into a master database and how you manage that and manage that effectively. And that's a critical aspect of this. That's why we see inadequate asset and data management occur out there. Some things, there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of equipment, keeping track of those, understanding facility, as Phil was talking about. What does that play into? It's a critical idea to capture that. Now, just because you have it, you better make sure that everybody that needs to know about it knows where it's at. And some of those people need to only have read capability. You do not want me writing into a database. I guarantee you, my auditors don't like that when I do things like that. You want the SMEs that have the roles and responsibilities to put that information in the database. And others that need to view it, just simply view it or export it, plain and simple. Now you've got to think about this. All these kind of tie into that master database. Strict access controls is what I was just talking about. And yesterday, Molly was talking about internal controls. If you think about these best practices, they are internal controls, plain and simple. And that's why they're important, that we understand your internal controls, that we have a good idea of what you're doing to manage this data, to have an understanding of how you deal with your assets. So think about the training aspect of it. Just because you have that database, just because you have roles and responsibilities for people, you got a new guy. Who was that new guy yesterday? Bob. Everybody's got a Bob, right? Bob comes in. How does he know what he has to do? How does he know what to do in that official database? What do you do to help them? So make sure that you have some good training in place. Make sure that you have peer review. You just let one person put something in and don't have a look at that, you've got an opportunity. Plain and simple. You might have an incomplete success. And we don't want that. We want good, accurate facility ratings so that people can make the right decisions. In my world, it's so ERCOT can make the right decisions. So think about contractor management. You know, we got a couple of consultants out there. We got a couple of contractors out there. How do they address things? How do they feed information into your database? How do they impact your facility ratings? And it's very critical. Now, remember, this is just a summarization of what's in that report. I want you to read that report. I want you to look at that report, have an understanding about what's in that report, because there's a lot more details in there. I got to point it this way. So let's go to theme 3, change management. Now, what's the difference between change management and asset management, data management? Everybody hates change. You're resistant to change. I like to have a lapel mic. I was resistant to this. I can't, but I adapted. But when you think about it, and I do want to say thank you to your crews that are out there doing storm restoration at 3 a.m. in the morning. Their goal is to get the power back on. Plain and simple. And that's something as a regulator I never want to forget. And most of you are probably primary compliance contacts, that sort of thing. But at emergency restoration, if you don't have a good process for that person out there in the field that's replacing that, what is it, bunting with, it's not Blue Jay, it's not Bluebird, I don't remember what blue it is. But if he's replacing that jumper out there, how does that feed back into your database? How do you understand how that impacts your facility ratings? What do you do? So there's a lot of challenges associated with those changes. Emergency restoration is one of the ones that's at the top. Hurricane comes through, you got to get the system back up. What goes back up? What goes back up in place, and how does that information get to the right locations? Inventory management sounds kind of funny, but if you think about it, you know, line conductors, everybody uses different conductors. So if you're doing out there restoring something, like I said, you might need to know exactly what was restored, what conductor was put back in place. And if you got Bluebird sitting next to bunting in your inventory, and you go and pull the wrong spool, so to speak, or you have the wrong stuff in your pickup or in your field gear, you may put the wrong thing in place and not know it. And that's an opportunity. Is it a big opportunity? Depends upon how it impacts that facility rating. Mergers and acquisitions, you heard Melanie talk about yesterday, the transformation of the grid. I can tell you in Texas, I have more GOs now than I've ever had, and I don't see that slowing down. But the opportunity is they get built, system gets built, 2 months later, somebody else buys them. 3 months later, a bigger team buys them. And so all that data all has to be merged somewhere. And getting that into a single database or getting an understanding of what was provided is very difficult. Change management is not one of the easiest things to do. Vendor changes. You heard about certification yesterday from 3.0 to 3.1, that sort of thought process. Well, is there a new change in your EMS for facility ratings, maybe to accommodate 881? How does that information from the old system get to the new system? If you change from Maximo 1.0 to Maximo 2.0, and I don't know what Maximo is on right now, how do you get that information merged over? What do you look at? How do you evaluate that and ensure that you have quality checks? Coordination between departments. Need I say more? A lot of us have silos. We used to have silos. We might still have a few, but we're breaking down those walls. We want to. So understand that coordination, communication between those departments is very, very important. Changes to existing equipment. I'm not going to read them all. I can't read them all. I can't follow a script. That's the worst thing in the world for me to do. But think about those things. Think about those challenges, because you have to address each and every one of them in some manner. You have to understand how it impacts those facility ratings. And it's important. Those underbuilds, encroachments, 2010, there was an alert put out. Everybody should have looked at their encroachments. That was 12 years ago. I don't know, has Phoenix changed in 12 years? Just a little bit. I know Austin has. It is a lot of different things. Contractor work verification, that's another opportunity for sure. You want to make sure you have an understanding of what you've paid for out there in the field and how it gets back to you for you to use. It's critically important to understand that. Now, some of the best practices, a change checklist. That's not surprising, is it? And it's not that checklist that's on the back of the bathroom door that says I checked it at 3 a.m. And you know it wasn't checked at 3 a.m. It's more of a robust look at changes. And a lot of things underneath this would be built into that. You know, a checklist could include quality assurance reviews after any change. How does that happen? What is a quality assurance review? You know, some of those different types of Southwire conductors, you know, maybe it's 608 or 680. What did they plug in to the database? Who verified that that was Bunting or Blue Jay? How did that occur? Periodic reviews, validation through periodic reviews. What we seen many years ago, 2004, I was with ERCOT, I was the network model manager. And unfortunately, I had to work with 16 different TOs and try to get an understanding of what their ratings were and compare it to the planning database. 2005, less than 20% of the ratings in the operating case and the planning case were the same. Does that surprise anybody? A couple of weeks ago, I was up at RF at CCC meeting, and Tim, the CEO up there, was talking to the CCC about facility ratings. And they're running across 1 out of every 5 facility ratings is incorrect. That's significant. And it gets more significant on the TO side than the GO side, but they're all very, very important to get to understand how the grid works, how it performs. So understand that periodic reviews are a good thing. It may be a pain, but set it up. It's a great internal control. Data entry verification at 608 versus 680. I heard Phil talk about periodic walkdowns. I guarantee you go through a process and you get into the enforcement realm, one of the mitigating opportunities for you as an entity will most likely be do a walk down. Plain and simple. And it may vary upon the risk of what we've seen. We've got large companies that had to do a total walk down of every one of their facilities. Not a fun thing. Money, budget, time, resources, whatever you want to call it. But there were opportunities there, and they had to mitigate those risks, mitigate those opportunities, and that was one way to do it. Approval process. Make sure you have the right approval process in place. And it may be several different steps of approval process. Make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what that is. Make sure that people get notified about those changes. It's critically important. Notification is not posting on a website. Posting on an internal website, to me, it's the worst form of notification I've ever seen, because that's assuming that I'm going out there to look at that website. Don't assume that employees are going to go look in a location. Notify them. Email, hey, we just changed this. Your role is this. Be ready to address that. Confirmation that the change is implemented as planned. Heard about developing information ahead of time. What's going to happen? You got this design that's going out there. Well, what is the as-built? Did it work? Did you get the right information in place? Did it bring back? And all this can be put into a change process flow chart. That simplifies it for some people. And if you start to think about it, if you have to draw a flow chart and you don't know where all the arrows should go, that's a good indicator that you should really dive deep into your process and have an understanding of change management. So that's theme 3. I think we go to theme 4 next.
That's
I'm gonna
me.
hand it over to Michael and
Yep.
step away.
Okay, thank you. I think the first thing I want to emphasize that Curtis mentioned is this report is really the best source of information for what we're trying to communicate. And it is a NERC report that had input from all the regions, as Steve mentioned at the beginning. So before I get started, if any of you have not been able to download that report, it is available on the NERC website. You can go there right now and find it in the listings. It's also on ours. I would suggest you download it and share it with everyone in your organization. It's really one of those, I think, great documents that can guide a lot of people just by letting them read it. I will tell you to this day, when we start new people in enforcement at WEC, I have them read the Southwest Outage Report and a lot of these other reports that we've done over the years, because they really, I think, are a lot of smart people sat down and took a lot of time to figure out what really needed to be communicated. And so our presentation today is largely based on trying to sell you to read the full package. So with that in mind, I just want to go over a few more of the theme 4 of this, which is the inconsistent development application of facility rating methodology. So the first best practice we identified is develop and maintain a detailed and comprehensive facility rating methodology. So obviously that's in the objective of what we were trying to do, and that sounds pretty simple. But as you've heard from the lessons of Phil and Jeff and Curtis, there's ways that we can come off on that. Maybe you have methodologies in your company that are separated from generation and transmission. That would be somewhere to look. Anywhere that you have options that are written into how you do that facility rating methodology, that would be a place you want to look to see if those options are necessary and they're leading to mistakes being made, because that's not clear and comprehensive to everyone if it's different within different parts of the organization. So likewise, use a single consistent methodology, applying same criteria to components of a facility. So I think Phil went over these things. If you have a line that maybe you have a different owner or operator on one end, or maybe even a different organization that owns different ends of the line, depending on where it terminates, make sure that you've looked at that equipment the same way. You've made all the same assumptions in how you're rating those things. If you have those options built into your rating methodology to allow people to do it differently, chances are they're going to do it differently because they're human beings and they'll vary at some point and use their own personal experience to make that calculation. Ensure the consistent application of facility ratings methodology across multiple internal divisions. Again, like I said earlier, what we see sometimes when things go wrong is that 2 parts of the organization didn't necessarily get together, maybe even 3 parts. Maybe there's parts that reside in the distribution, transmission, and generation, and you've separated them all. You got to make sure you have consistency across and that all those divisions are talking across your company. Provide the specific rating method for each class and type of equipment comprising a BES facility. So in this case, I think some of the things we saw is that make sure that you're using the same assumptions and rating consistently each time you put that into the field, or that you provide the people the specific ratings that you're going to use for that, and make sure they're consistent instead of allowing perhaps the recalculation of it every time it's used. Train appropriate personnel on how to consistently apply the methodology. This goes back to, I think, really like when I started here in 2007, I was told PR is one of the most important standards because of the importance of training. Again, that stands up here. How you train your staff and how familiar they are with the methodology. I mean, I'm sure they're all applying algebra the same way when they go do the calculation, but it's the factors that they're putting into the algebra to make sure they're consistent. And if you have a good comprehensive training program that covers everyone in the company, you're going to get a lot better result. And then finally, increase coordination with jointly owned facilities to ensure common ratings are used. I think Phil did a really good job of mentioning how this could be wrong over the years, or how what we've seen out in the field where the mistakes get made. You really have to communicate and coordinate closely with your neighboring entity, especially if you have common facilities. This is like sharing a bank account with someone. If you have two different ideas how much money's in the bank, you're going to have really bad results probably at some point. It's the same kind of method thinking, right? You got to understand how they see the line, how you see the line, and talk about how you arrived at those answers to make sure you're consistent in the future. So I think this way. Okay. So just to cover that, so the theme 1 was a lack of awareness. Theme 2, inadequate asset and data management. Theme three, excuse me, inadequate change management. And theme 4, inconsistent development and application of facility rating methodology. Again, we just covered these in summary today. I'm sure we're not going to impart correct ratings on you in 1 hour, but I would encourage all of you to download this report, save it on your desktop, distribute it amongst the people you know. It's a great report and a good read. So now we are ready for questions and answers.
And, you know, when you think about it, the information in this document can really apply to any high population standard. You don't have to limit this information to facility ratings. Does it cover everything those other standards need? Probably not, but there's a lot of good information in this report that could be applied to multiple standards.
And Jeff will answer all the questions.
If you got questions, Jeff Hankers.
If you've got questions, please put them in the Hoove app. And the report is also in the materials on the Hoove app too. So for those that are part of the conference, you can download it directly there. And just, kind of an underscore, Curtis mentioned, snow in Texas, but not just in the operations and planning's context, but we've seen in events and major activities that facility ratings are implicated, because in these emergency events, operators need to make decisions based on what they know, and the facility ratings impact some of those decisions in many ways. And so there's really real world impacts and implications. So that ties into why, as a regulator, this becomes a significant area of focus for us. And we've identified it as such, put it out as part of our implementation plan year over year. And I'm doing outreach like this to try to connect to best practices or controls, as Curtis says, so that we collectively enhance focus and performance on this matter. We're getting a couple questions that come in. This one asks if there's an example of a facility change process flow chart that you've seen, and maybe I'll ask if you all have examples, but also might be also a good opportunity for the WICF to look at sharing amongst themselves too. If they're not already, they probably are.
So I'm gonna take a little twist on this. I've seen automation of change management process where a registered entity developed a database tool that actually goes to the as-built design drawings and pulls the information into the database. And then that database is able to write IDEVs, automated inputs into their model. So they're able to, and then within this database, they are tracking future facilities. And so they have the date of intended in service. And with a few clicks of a button, they can take that ready-made future state facility, and when it's in service, put it into the live database, and then use that live database to populate their planning and operations models.
Now, just briefly, if you look at the top picture in theme 3 was kind of an easy man's look at what we have seen in some cases from a best practice perspective. Have we seen an exact flow chart? It's going to be different for each and every company, right? Everybody has a different set of departments, that sort of thought process. But that was some of the basics that we saw in some of the very good programs that we have approached. So I think it's important to understand that it may be very different for your company. The smaller your company is, it may all circle around Betty Lou doing something. If you're a bigger company, it may have 3 or 4 different departments that have to do something and get that approval, get that kickoff, get that notification thought process. So you have to build it from the ground up from what your experience is. And that's a great thing for an auditor to see. And yeah, I am an auditor, right? I have to be able to ask you questions about that process. I have to understand your internal controls to fully understand how you're meeting the criteria, the reliability standards. But it's a great tool to use. And I've actually challenged some vendors to create one for their smaller entities. A lot of vendors work with GOs, create one for the GOs, create one for the smaller TOs, and that way they can use something.
Great. Next question's on dynamic line ratings. The report doesn't mention dynamic line ratings in FERC 881. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first and foremost, 2 sets of books is usually eventually going to get one of those books being wrong. So incorporating 881 into your facility rating methodology is likely a very good step forward. This is going to increase the complexity, right? Because now not only do you have to understand the rating of every element in series, but you have to understand how it is affected by ambient temperature at the very minimum, some of which might not be. Some of those nameplates are 1 rating, maybe with an emergency rating multiplier, but that's it. There's no ambient temperature associated with that. So that might be the ceiling of whatever occurs as the temperature drops and say the conductor rating starts going up. Sounds to me like if you're a small organization, you need very well-trained SMEs with very clear ways of tracking this. If you're a large organization, tools may need to be developed in order to accommodate that. But I highly encourage incorporating whatever you need to follow 881 into your NERC facility ratings methodology and make it the source of truth for your organization for what's in the field.
Yeah, just briefly, I'll let the lawyers figure out if 881 is applicable in ERCOT. Since it did come from the market side of FERC. Yes, Jeff, I'm talking about you back there in the back corner. Didn't throw you under the bus though. But the opportunity there is, if you think about bare overhead conductor, IEEE has a standard. I think 20 years ago, there was 47 different inputs you could have for the rating of a conductor. And one of those was temperature. And if you just move that temperature through the range of what you had a 27% increase in your line rating or the capability. ERCOT does have ambient adjusted dynamic ratings in their systems. They've had them for years. Not every TO uses them, but I think you got to get the base right. You got to get that base facility rating right before you start applying changes in temperature, changes in wind speed direction, that sort of thing, whatever is included in your methodology. So, and that's really the critical part of this report. Get the basics right. And 881 came out, what, 9 months ago, 7 months ago. And this was already underway, at least that far back. So we didn't necessarily include all the specifics because it didn't blend well with what we were trying to get at. Get the basics right and then apply 881.
Yeah, I guess all I would add is that from my experience working on some of the enforcement items that have come through is that we do see Or at least it would probably worth the time to review your ambient temperature assumptions based on the last few years. That seems to be a changing landscape for where those assumptions are capped. Obviously, we've seen some hot temperatures that are making that a little more of a consideration probably than it was a few years ago.
Great. Well, here's a question that's specific on, I think, trying to encourage engineering groups and entities and how maybe the compliance team can do that. But I want to expand on it maybe and ask like an additional piggybacking broader question. So, the question is, how do you convince your engineering groups to perform periodic walkdowns when they push back saying they don't have the manpower or time to do this? And I think the piggyback question I would just put on more broadly is, maybe a little discussion of your thoughts around, some of those broader things we're talking about with respect to controls and our oversight plan, and how the things that entities do to demonstrate the work that they're doing to understand and mitigate their risks informs the interaction and differentiates the experience that you and your regions have with them.
So one factor in this is there's a fundamental issue that we always think about as auditors, and is the population we're given accurate, right? It's part of what might keep us up at night and might keep you up at night, because it's a lot easier to understand your controls once you understand that the inputs to those controls are accurate, right? So we've had some entities that do periodic substation inspections annually, but they're not just doing it for FAC 8. They're doing it for PRC 5. They're doing it to understand what SIP applicable devices might be there. They're making sure that they know what's in the field in order to make sure that all those downstream controls are accurate. Now, the people who might be able to do much of these inspections might be able to gather the information from multiple standards. So there may be efficiencies to gain through that. The accountants wrote a check for something that's out there in the field. They want to make sure that you're utilizing it appropriately, and that what you have out there is what you need, right? So it's the compliance, I like to say, is like 5th grade math. It is get your assignment done on time, make sure you do all of it, and show your work. And as an engineer, I hated showing my work, right? I hated it. But when I entered the compliance realm, I'm like, oh, that's why. And as I start to work on other people's work, right, then I understand the importance of this. This is like showing your work. That's part of the pushback. So is it an investment in your organization? Yes, but it's an investment to manage your risks, to keep the bad things from happening.
Trying to follow up a 5th grade analogy there. No, I think it's always critically important. Every PCC has that opportunity with their groups. They bring the bad message. There was an issue here. We got to correct it. And they've got to convince the groups as to why. And that's partially in this report. We've got to have proper facility ratings in order to operate the system in the most reliable and secure manner. And they need to understand it, because if they continue down the path of doing the same thing and don't verify what they have in the field, those field conditions are very unique. I watched a TV show here the other day, and it was talking about a particular company out here in the West and inspecting some lines and seeing that the hooks, after all these years, split and drop the line onto the ground and drop the line into the poles and all this other good stuff. We have the same in Texas. We used to have a line that would burn off cross arms about once a month until somebody went out there to figure out why. And it was dropping a load at that point. And it was kind of funny because the TO that owned the line didn't own the load, so to speak, or wasn't associated with the load. It happened to be my company back then. So they didn't care whether those customers got dropped. I was the one that got the calls as to why it was dropped. So it's important to emphasize the importance of facility ratings, the importance of those facility walkdowns, and think about it from a risk-based perspective. Because work with your enforcement group, if that comes out as a mitigation thing, here, this is what we're planning to do. Here are our highest risks. This is what we need to do. Is a brand new line a high risk? Maybe not so much unless it's carrying a heck of a lot of load for some reason. But think about it in that respect. We suffer the same thing in terms of resource constraints. There's 100 risks we need to follow. Where do we put our emphasis? And right now, the ERO enterprise is putting it on facility ratings quite a bit.
Yeah, again, all I would add is my experience at 20 years ago, when I had a responsibility for an outside crew, we had a similar situation. Our CEO came in and I think people were complaining to him, like, how are we possibly going to get all this stuff done? And he just said, can you tell me a time in the last 20 years when you had people sitting around? I don't see how the condition has changed at all. You're just going to have to figure it out in your operations, how to prioritize these things. So probably what it comes down to is proving the rate of return on that investment of spending the time walking down the lines and convincing your peers that it is worth the time, and that in the end, that'll be a good investment. I think that's really what it comes down to.
And have that risk-based, right? Maybe your 345 kV line it needs to be walked down more often than a 115, an IRL, probably the most frequent. But if it's systematic and over time, you're checking what's in the field, you're going to find those errors before the event finds those errors. And, it's not just that a facility rating, was higher than it was supposed to be. There's impacts when a facility rating is lower than what's actually in the field. And that shows up in uneconomical dispatch, or during an event, you might be shedding load that you didn't need to shed due to a facility rating in your models being lower than what was actually in the field and what the field could actually handle.
Great. There's some specific interest in a comment you made, Curtis, related to ERCOT. So this somebody keyed on the reference you made to ERCOT and how they use their energy management system to inform the planning model. And so the EMS was considered the master database of facility ratings. Do you know whether the ERCOT model, EMS model down, do you know whether does the ERCOT EMS model down to the equipment level also, or is the equipment held separately in an EAM system?
That's an interesting aspect of life. EMSs are very interesting animals. I cut my teeth early on in EMSs. I was hired as a EMS test engineer in my first goal. And what I had to do was test power network applications, which was power flows. First thing I had to do is put in substations and everything associated with it. So you might be able to put a breaker into an EMS, but I don't know of an EMS today that has a breaker rating. Has a breaker limit perhaps that you can assign to it, but not necessarily a breaker rating. So the ERCOT model is very similar. It was 20 years ago when I managed it. They have a transmission line, and we had to define what a transmission line was. A lot of the stuff that Phil went over this morning or earlier today, back in 2005, there was a guy that was there that said, this is a transmission line. This is a transmission line, and this is what we expect from you as TOs to supply information. And guess what? It was bus to bus. The disconnect, the breaker, the other disconnect, the conductor, everything. And I know that because I was that guy. There's notes. I had to show somebody some notes less than 6 months ago from 2005 that were still public that said this is a transmission line. So the equipment is local. Your TOs, your GOs have the wave trap information, have the disconnect information, have the breaker information, whatever it might be. At the ERCOT level, it is at the facility. They've got to label line X, and this is the facility rating. Now that discussion about jointly owned, is there a 10-minute time limit? Okay. There was a discussion about jointly owned. The way ERCOT got around that many years ago was what they considered a jointly owned percentage of a line So some of those configurations that Phil was putting up, it was the obligation of the two owners to determine what a facility rating was based on their methodology. Now, I can tell you again, I've seen where the same conductor is on the same poles going to the same substation owned by two different people, and they have different ratings. And that's allowed because both companies had different methodologies. And it's very interesting to see that. But, at the end of the day, the TOs and the GOs have the equipment. They're obligated to give a facility rating to ERCOT. If they're two different owners, the ERCOT system will take the lowest rating, and that'll be the rating of that facility. So they don't keep the individual equipment. That's local, not at the ERCOT level.
Great. I think the themes report and the fall downs that we're seeing, the largest fall downs are probably concentrated at the transmission level. But I think there's some curiosity of thoughts of an example of an incorrect generator facility rating that could cause a BES impact.
In general, and let's under the responding to this question, let's assume that it's radio, that there's no network facilities in this GEO's system. Then the consequence of an incorrect facility rating is most likely the tripping of the generator, right? Maybe with a long lead time to recover. It depends on system conditions how impactful that would be. If you incorporate network facilities into that, then the errors are much more complex because the power flow is that could impact how the flow, what flows are going through that could really be unpredictable, especially during an extreme event. I'd also say that the one thing to pay in risk assessment and assessing what to focus on is your black start cranking path. Is that facility rating accurate so that you know what it's capable of and if the worst should come?
I'll give you a small example or maybe two. Nobody talks about wind plants retiring. Some of them have been out there long enough to retire. Some of them are repowering. And when they start to repower, are they considering the impact on facility ratings? How far down the path does that go? They just replaced a 1.5 megawatt with a 3.0 megawatt per individual wind turbine. So how many of those did they implement? And they don't do it overnight, right? It's not a snap change. It's not from a 150 megawatt farm to a 300 megawatt farm. It happens over time. So how has that impacted facility ratings? We have seen that. We've also seen where GOs may own the transformer. And let's just be honest, that's not their forte. Some of them, I hope I don't offend too many people. Notice I didn't say everybody, but the opportunity there is we have been at ERCOT. I know they were submitted a transformer rating that was lower than the actual output of the facility. And it took several times to get that entity to understand the impact of that facility rating that they provided on the economic side of life. Finally, when we talked to them about dollars, they understood and adjusted the rating appropriately. So there have been a few impacts like that.
Great. Well, thanks so much, gentlemen. I want to thank you both for coming, all three of you for coming, of course, but Michael was coming for other reasons as well. So thanks so much for both of you for coming from the other regions. I thought this was a good conversation. We have a focus on facility ratings throughout today. We're going to continue it after lunch. I understand people are hungry, so we want to make sure you do get to lunch. But first, join me in thanking the panel for a great presentation today. And we start